Tomb Raider is a series that has always been in my periphery. My first experience was a demo disc on the PS1, with a level of Tomb Raider 2 that I couldn't get more than a couple of minutes into, before ending up stuck and confused. From there, basically nothing really, until Tomb Raider 2013 came out. I saw the article features for games like Angel of Darkness, Legends, Anniversary, and Underworld in magazines back in the day, and I might have played a demo for Legends or something on the Xbox 360 if there was one, but otherwise, the closest I got to playing through a Tomb Raider game was my first playthrough of Uncharted 2 in 2011 or so. However, a friend of mine had recently made his way back home in early 2013 and had copies of Far Cry 3, BioShock Infinite, and the Tomb Raider 2013 Reboot, all when they were basically brand new games. I very rarely got the chance to play new games back then, so when he asked me if I wanted to borrow them, I was all for it. He let my little brother start with Tomb Raider while I shifted back and forth between Far Cry and Infinite. Despite Tomb Raider being a different experience from the other two, despite my brother loving the game, and despite enjoying what I played, I kinda just stopped playing Tomb Raider 2013 around halfway through, and never finished it before I gave the games back. In fact, it was the only one of the 3 games that I didn't devour like I was starving to death. From then forward to now, I still never really touched any of the games more than briefly. I played around with Rise of the Tomb Raider as one of my first PS4 games. It was one of a handful of games we were testing the performance and visual options for the PS4 Pro with, on a friend's 4K television, but that was pretty much it. So back in August of last year, or thereabouts, I decided to finally retackle Tomb Raider 2013 for a video. Maybe if I had to finish it for a video, I actually would. My brother by this point was a huge fan of the series, and so he recommended I try some of the older games too. I took his advice and decided to expand this video into one about each of the 3 first games for Lara Croft, so to speak. Tomb Raider 1, the Remake, Anniversary, and the Reboot, Tomb Raider 2013. Obviously, though, I'd already nearly finished 2013, and I felt it would skew my opinion if I played the games in backward order, but then looked at them in forward order in the script. So instead, we're going backwards for this video as well, from the newest and most modernized game of the trio, to the fully realized but officially retro remake of her first game, and finally stopping off at the tank-controlled, supposedly clunky original that started it all. So, no more spinning our wheels then. Let's get into Tomb Raider 2013. To start, the PC version is a very mild mess. Just a word of warning. The fancy Tress Effects hair physics still crippled my frame rate during cutscenes if other settings were high, despite the game being nearly 11 years old at this point. Apparently the game has to be set to an earlier patch or parts of the HUD get cut off. They're unimportant parts of the HUD, but still. And there's an issue where it crashes on loading after death sometimes. Otherwise, though, it still mechanically feels solid, and 60 FPS transforms the otherwise mundane gameplay into something really snappy. While the visuals are still nice today, they're definitely of their time. Bloom, lots of muted colors, etc. Animations at times also feel strangely cartoon-like, which was a bit of a surprise, because so many of the rest of them are mocapped. Sound design for me felt fine, if unremarkable. Nothing stood out as particularly good or bad, which I suppose is perfectly okay. The same can really be said about the narrative. Nothing in this story is something you haven't seen before. It didn't feel particularly deftly written, but other than one specific moment, nothing felt poorly written either. That moment was something that got attention back in the day, where one of the villains captures Lara and suggests he's about to violently sexually assault her. She then gets the upper hand, and he ends up being the first person Lara has to kill. This moment is complicated, so we're going to talk about it in a minute. Suffice it to say, though, that this game is a story of empowerment and survival, and I think it tackles that mostly solid enough just in ways that I don't think are particularly inspired. Some people do tend to bristle against the brutality of Lara's deaths during QuickTime events or when you fail a scripted segment, and to some extent I get it. When paired with that one moment that I think really drops the ball, it can feel crass and exploitative. Personally, the violence doesn't bother me, because I think the harm done by going soft in Lara's death scenes, while characters like Leon and RE4 can be hit with equally brutal abuse, would be greater. Again, this is still a story of empowerment and survival, so I don't think treating Lara as if she's succeeding against lesser dangers is beneficial to female protagonists at large. And it's not like being impaled on a tree branch channels anything related to domestic abuse against women. I don't think the intent here was to revel in violence against women, but rather to show the harshness of the situation Lara has found herself in, as if she was any other protagonist. If this was a story about Lara Croft, we all know the brutality would still be here. And what's more, while deaths might not be as bloody in earlier games, after finishing games from the two previous Tomb Raider eras, I can say they've certainly always had a sense of brutality to them. Lara can also dish out fully visible brutality in kind, both in scripted QuickTime event segments, like the first guy she has to kill, and through combat executions. But I do also understand how it can read as a bit sexist when alongside the moment where they arbitrarily write her as a sexual object purely for shock value. It can feel like the writers lacked tact where it was really necessary. I bring this up, of course, purely because it was such a major topic surrounding the game at launch, and was really one of the only aspects of the narrative design that caught my interest. Everything else was pretty standard and uninteresting for me. I think these sorts of discussions have matured a lot in games since this game released, even if pseudo-alpha male snowflakes have been trying to fight back harder at the same time. As a quick aside, I also don't love the joke where a guy on the boat crew says a 14-year-old girl in a photo is a fox. Yes, he didn't know she was a kid, and sure, he wasn't interested after he learned her age, but I've said it in previous videos and I'll say it again. Writers write stories. They are completely free to choose what they write, how they write it, the context in which it's supposed to have value, and how characters within that context behave. As a joke, something that had to be created whole cloth by a writer because all of these characters are fictional and have no real world personality or autonomy, as a joke that has no bearing on the narrative as a whole and contributes nothing to the themes or ideas the story presents, I find it hard to justify as more than just a weird bit of bad taste humor. Maybe I'm missing some meta context related to events that happened in the history of the Tomb Raider franchise. I don't know, but for me, making completely unnecessary jokes about adult men being attracted to minors as a light and easy to brush off gotcha moment isn't exactly cohesive with the game's story as a whole. It's a small thing and a small moment, but I was taken aback when I heard it played so straight. The narrative at large boils down to Lara figuring out the history of an evil queen of sorts who uses other women to maintain immortality and who supposedly has powers that make it impossible to leave the island. Get too close and you'll end up dead or stuck there forever. And all of the people you find on the island when you get there have suffered this fate already, and joined into groups, including a cult that tries to serve this queen in a way. Again, other than a few moments, it's not a bad story, but it's not anything I haven't seen plenty of times either, and there were only a handful of visual storytelling bits that I found compelling. As a start to Lara's rebooted journey though, where she goes from Green Explorer to fully fledged Tomb Raider, it did its job. I just wish I could have gotten something a bit more novel for a reboot for such an iconic character, in particular because the game invests so much of your time on the narrative through the cutscenes. Anyway, before we circle back around to discuss the controversial bit directly, let's dive into the actual game more directly. For me, Tomb Raider starts off a bit slow, especially if you were a fan of the previous games. I can see it feeling even worse, because Anniversary and Tomb Raider 1 throw you right in. But here, it takes a while to get all of your core foundational mechanical options and for the game to let you loose. One of the first things I noticed was just how awful powerful the camera shake was. Another thing that was very popular to overdo around that time period, thanks to Gears of War popularizing it. Apparently, here it's a problem related to running the game at 60 FPS, but it shouldn't be a problem at all, and I should be able to lessen or outright disable it. The core design of Tomb Raider 2013... See what I did there? You know, because the original developers of Tomb Raider were core design... You know what? Never mind. The core design of Tomb Raider 2013 centers around third-person stealth, third-person shooting, and third-person platforming within semi-open level chunks. It uses a Metroidvania-style world structure where you'll explore parts of an area, but you're restricted due to a limited toolset. Then, as you get more tools, you can return to those earlier areas and explore parts of them that you previously couldn't. Considering the emphasis in this reboot is not purely on puzzles and platforming exploration with a side of basic combat, I think for a broad audience it was worth the hit to immersion that the game relies on such heavy degrees of signposting in the environment. Does it make me internally sigh a bit that the bright white ropes and the similarly craggy rock faces and all of these other things make it painfully obvious what bits of the environment you can interact with and how? Yes, but unlike previous Tomb Raider games, they wanted combat to play a bigger role and also wanted stealth to be a heavy part of the experience. That means players aren't always going to be seeing the space within the platforming-centric headspace that they would have previously, and frustrations could be a huge problem if it wasn't clear what parts of the environment were interactive or in what ways. Still, I wish it was a bit more subtle. As a whole, this isn't really a game about raiding tombs in that sense. Now, far be it from me to suggest that Tomb Raider has to literally include ancient tombs as the primary environment you explore, but with hindsight, it is a bit disappointing that they're largely relegated to optional side activities so that you can instead focus on shooting and stabbing a bunch of humans. If there's any problem I have with the violence in this game, it would be that I don't think it was necessary to turn it into a third-person cover shooter. It could have stood out to a far greater and longer-lasting capacity if it was allowed to be 75% platformer and 25% stealth action cover shooter. Granted, some of the tombs are interesting, like the early one where you have to figure out how to manipulate the wind in order to blow a platform around in the right ways and the right times. Or the flooded vault much later was fun as well. In it, you need to pull a raft around to cross electrified water. Your goal is basically to remove the massive light from the water temporarily so that it's no longer electrified. And then after you've crossed, you need to time lifting the light again and putting the raft under it so it no longer lands back in the water and electrifies it. But many are otherwise very basic and hardly more in-depth than the general treasure hunting on the island at large. See a thing, do the right thing with the right thing on that thing. Because of the signposting, it's usually pretty obvious what you need to do, particularly in the treasure hunting. The main difference in tombs themselves is that they usually have a visually distinct aesthetic that makes them feel a bit more bespoke, and you usually have to manage a few different things where you do the right thing with the thing on the thing, in the right order. I did enjoy the ones that make you think beyond the very restrictive, blatant use of your tools. Like, the reason people still admire Half-Life 2's moment-to-moment physics and environmental puzzles, like the early one where you have to put the cement blocks on the wood to weigh it down, which is something you do in Tomb Raider here, by the way, is specifically because there are no key mechanics or limited use tools tied to them. You're using your deductive reasoning skills and a set of mechanics that hold a wealth of purposes beyond puzzle solving, if only for a super simple task, to progress. There is a huge difference between that and seeing bright white ropes and using the only thing that interacts with bright white ropes on the bright white ropes. That's not to say that type of design is inherently awful, it just gets old if the game is too long, and it rarely provides the depth you'd hope for. Some tombs also needed just a bit of polish. Take this one, for example. In it, you have to blow up some green smoke and destroy some debris to climb up a ways. Then you climb up a bit more and shoot fire arrows at another bit of debris to jump across. Like most of these, I'd hardly call this a tomb, but even if it felt satisfactory, the second clump of debris just didn't want to burn for some reason. When the game is so clearly signposted, issues like this can actually lend to confusing the player even more, because it suddenly feels like you should be looking for some other extremely obvious piece to the solution that you missed. Beyond the tombs the game is named after, there honestly isn't much that I felt was worth discussing in this game mechanically. I don't want it to sound like I hate this game, or think it's bad. It's very unremarkable, but it also has its moments. It's polished in most ways that matter, but it did almost nothing for me, and I think that's why I ended up not finishing it back in the day. It's just a bit too simple and restrictive for my liking, and I've played a million different games like it. I like the bow, but I liked it better in Far Cry 3. The stealth is very basic. The shooting feels better than Uncharted 1 or 2 did by a country mile, but still doesn't do almost anything special. The enemies primarily being humans means they don't offer much mechanically that you haven't seen everywhere else. I can't really use my platforming options in ways related to movement during combat. There's no persistence to add complexity, nor any strategic modifications enemies make as you progress. No guys suddenly wearing helmets to specifically protect against headshots like in Metal Gear Solid 5 or what have you. I didn't find the boss fights particularly notable. I didn't find most of the level design very remarkable. I had little interest to explore for relics or other goodies, since there was never anything engaging to find that expanded my arsenal in optional ways, like you'd find in other games with Metroidvania world design. I didn't find any of the weapons or character upgrades interesting or even that useful most of the time. It's a game that works, but is also just kinda there. Okay, so it's time for that controversial detour. I want to be crystal clear really quickly, in that I'm not an authority, nor the authority on this game or this topic. But I think I know enough to at least discuss it in a way that's fruitful rather than overly dramatic and harmful. As I said earlier, one of the biggest controversies with this game back at release was an early scene where Lara is trying to escape captivity and has to kill someone for the first time in order to do so. The controversy wasn't due to the graphic nature of the kill, nor the act itself. Instead, the thing that caused a stir was the fact that she was defending herself from what was very much implied in-game and marketed as by the dev team to be an attempted violent sexual assault. This on its own isn't inherently wrong. That sort of thing unfortunately happens in real life, and telling stories that include such acts can reflect that reality. It can build empathy in the person experiencing that narrative, educate them on the topic, raise the stakes of the story, etc. But it's also a subject that should be explored with far more tact than it usually is, and it should be used far less frequently than it usually is. The problems with this choice in Tomb Raider aren't as simple as the straw man defenders built up in order to deflect criticism, like I unfortunately did back in the day. When writing a moment where a character is threatened with this kind of assault, there are really three major factors that you should be looking to tread carefully around: thematic and narrative relevance, the level of gratuity, and who/what is impacted by the act. In this case, the level of gratuity is low. The assault ultimately basically goes nowhere, and as such, the scene doesn't get graphic. Who and what is impacted by the act is, on the surface, similarly benign here. This threat isn't used to drive a male hero's determination in saving Lara. It isn't used to build up the person doing the assault as a fierce, extra dangerous villain that Lara will have to contend with later on. He's dead not long after he tries to assault her, so the person who is impacted and driven by this threat is theoretically Lara herself, which in a narrative like this would be good. In a vacuum, that's what you'd want to see, because it doesn't rely on objectifying or traumatizing her in order to manifest growth in someone else. It's also worth noting that Lara doesn't turn on a seductive switch in order to bring his guard down, as you'd see in many stories with situations like this, particularly with quote-unquote femme fatale style characters. This means her sexuality isn't highlighted as a core aspect of her defenses. In that specific way, she's able to be a woman without being sexualized by the writers when it's not relevant. She's not choosing to fall into that role of sexual object in order to escape being treated as one. And that also means that the moment isn't used to titillate the audience with a display of sensuality from our traditionally attractive heroine. which of course leaves us with the thematic and narrative relevance of that aspect of the scene. Again, I want to be clear in that it's not inherently bad to explore assault in the story you want to tell. The issue arises when it's a default form of danger or trauma for women in media, when it becomes the shorthand way to impose danger on a character that needs saving, or the quick and easy way to force cheap empathy onto the audience. Using it recklessly can still dilute the character down to an object not only for the aggressor, but also the audience. When everyone is haphazardly using assault plot points as a crutch in order to build tension and danger for women in their narratives, it undermines the seriousness and severity of the act itself. It starts to manifest a stereotype that ties women as people to assault victimhood, and that shapes how real women can move through the world and how society treats them as a whole. It can also affect how seriously people take it when a woman admits she was sexually assaulted. There are plenty of other dangers that can be imposed on a female character that have the same narrative effect when you're not explicitly trying to explore the impact of sexual abuse and violence. There's no reason why assault like this should be so ubiquitously used against female characters, especially when so few authors reflect on the aftermath of it. Assault shouldn't be written to be over and done with as soon as the imminent danger passes. Assault should instead generally be used to humanize and flesh out the victim, to say something about the act and how it impacts those it's wielded against. If you're going to write it, you need to devote a large part of your narrative to exploring its impact. If it instead serves to dilute that character into an object for narrative punishment, there's a problem. Tomb Raider 2013 is a story about empowerment of a woman, but I can't in good faith argue it's a story about broader female empowerment. This isn't a game that thematically targets patriarchal issues or seems to be trying to bolster feminist ideals. It's a story about Lara as an individual becoming the strong, competent Tomb Raider we all know. You could spin a few narrative choices into being about feminist theming. Early on, there are a couple of moments where Lara very briefly references the historical precedent for women being seen as witches and how women are vilified when they have power. I'm sure you could spin her dip and subsequent rise from the river of blood into a feminine rebirth, an acceptance that she needs to be more like herself rather than exclusively trying to be like the character she looks up to, Roth, who is a man. I'm fairly certain every enemy you face is male except for the main villain, Himiko, who is presented as a witch that these men are trying to exploit for her power. Reyes could be seen as a harsh rejection of traditional femininity that clashes with Lara's willingness to embrace it as a form of power. There also isn't really a romance between Lara and anyone else in the narrative, with the one potential romance with Alex being decidedly one-sided. He wants her, she doesn't really seem to want him. But I think this would be in bad faith to a large extent, because these moments and ideas really only suggest such theming in isolation. There's never a focus on them, nor reinforcement of them. Nobody comments on such topics. None of the relics that I found had anything in their descriptions to reinforce it. The tombs don't have any art design or level design that suggests this is theming, and there are plenty of equally important bits of context that contradict this reading. Full disclosure, 2 of the 3 writers I could find for the game online were women, Susan O'Connor and Rihanna Pratchett, so it's entirely possible a heavily feminist theming was intentional, and far be it from me to suggest they're wrong in some way if they wrote it with that intention. I also could absolutely be missing something, but for me, if this is a narrative about feminist ideology and empowerment, then it's one that's decidedly unfocused and unwilling to fully commit to that. Could be studio interference that caused that, development difficulties, other priorities, or a wealth of other perfectly understandable issues, but I just didn't see it as intentional. Himiko, in all her power, is still treated as outright evil. Sure, only one man is allowed to attend to her, and she otherwise surrounds herself with women, but that man is also the only person she truly trusts, considering he's the only one that knows the true impact of the ritual to pass on her powers. Other women close to her are instead servants, and a select few are groomed to conform to Himiko's demands, so that she can usurp control over their bodies and continue life destroying their soul to make room for hers in the process. These things alone sort of dismantle any outright feminist reading of the narrative for me, because they reinforce negative tropes and roles imposed onto female characters all the time in storytelling. The woman who needs a man by her side, the woman who only trusts men and exploits other women. And there's no commentary here about how that's a toxic way to approach womanhood. Beyond just Himiko, Sam is treated almost exclusively like a damsel throughout the narrative. Reyes' issues with Lara don't ever have anything to do with her more feminine attributes, but rather her drive and eventual competency in the realm of violence and protection, both of which are traditionally male-coded. Reyes herself is also very driven, but her issue with Lara is more about her recklessness and everyone's willingness to follow that recklessness purely because she's a Croft. Sure, Alex's romantic affection for Lara is one-sided and impacts his characterization more than hers, but the story still defaults to a cliché male hero-centric ending for his character, where he sacrifices himself to give her an escape. Given Alex's frustration with his lack of ability to contribute or shine through the group, and his subsequent rush into danger, which is largely implied to be a way to prove himself as a useful man, which he hopes Lara might find attractive for its bravery, this reads distinctly traditional in terms of male/female power dynamics in narratives. It reinforces his reckless implementation of masculine traits as misguided, but ultimately favorable and heroic. He doesn't get into that situation because his traditionally masculine actions are presented as toxic, but instead it's that he's just not actually shown to be quote-unquote masculine enough by the narrative to make it out successfully. In other words, it's still a show of traditionally male-coded power and sacrifice in order to get Lara out of a sticky situation, and it still praises reckless masculinity as something that can be lauded. The narrative punishes him for not being masculine enough, and then rewards him with heroism when he reaches their arbitrary masculinity goals of sacrifice. The guy on the boat crew who was the butt of the joke I mentioned earlier, by the way, the one that shares his attraction for a picture of a 14-year-old girl before realizing the mistake? Yeah, that's Alex. His attraction to a minor is played for laughs. His lack of traditional masculinity is shown to be a flaw that drives him to dangerous behavior, and then the narrative gilds him in heroic praise when he sacrifices himself to save the girl he loves. Were his sacrifice useless, it could have read as a criticism of traditional masculinity, pushing him to do dangerous things. But you can't reward him for that afterward. No action Lara chooses to take reflects on feminist ideas and themes, particularly in relation to the assault, at all either. She doesn't even comment on the near assault after it happens. Instead, she's much more traumatized by the fact that she had to kill someone in self-defense. If both had narrative stakes, both should be weighed as emotionally important traumas to work through. And on top of this, while Lara's empathy for others is considered a strong trait by the narrative, the story also occasionally punishes her for utilizing it, like when she defies Roth to try and rescue the pilots that tried and failed to rescue them.
I have to get to him.
No.
His signal's just over there.
We've got our own people to worry about.
A few moments later.
Oh my god!
Instead, more often than not, the masculine-coded, violent, and physically capable traits she has are the ones that consistently get her out of the worst situations. I don't think there's a single time where she chooses to use those masculine-coded traits in a way that ends up in a long-term failure that she can't reverse. That's not to say that a character that's a woman exhibiting and excelling at using masculine-coded traits is bad. Far from it. But if the narrative were going for a more feminist slant that embraces womanhood as strength, I think we'd see that being presented as just as powerful of a tool for her. At points, it is like refusing to leave Sam behind when the others want to leave, or when she's trying her best to patch up Roth's wounds, or the multitude of other times where she elects to not emotionally give up on people she cares for. But the point is that these aspects of her character fail her more often than her more traditionally masculine traits, the ones the entire narrative is about her building up in order to conquer the insurmountable nightmare before her. I think one of the most telling things here is that you could replace Lara with the aforementioned Larry Croft and it wouldn't impact any of the themes of the story beats. That tells me pretty clearly that none of them are feminine coded in ways that extend beyond Lara as an individual. And because of that, and everything outlined above, it becomes pretty clear why defaulting to a man deciding he can take sexual advantage of her for no reason other than to create narrative tension is a problematic moment. It's just tired, you know? If you're going to have a moment like that, do something with it. Say something with it. Otherwise, you're just kind of exploiting the reality that women in real life face major issues with sexual assault and sexual harassment in order to create a shocking moment of danger that feels feminine coded. It would not have changed anything if instead he planned to torture her with plain old violence, or if he'd have threatened to put her in a cage with hungry wolves, or if he wanted to throw her in a hole and starve her as punishment for trying to escape, or any number of other stake-raising narrative threats which would force her to kill him in order to avoid them. And in a way, that kind of makes it the worst type of narrative usage for sexual assault, because it's entirely replaceable, diluted down into a meaningless, temporary bit of tension at the expense of Lara and anyone else playing who has been in that situation. You don't need to point to Lara's looks and threaten her sexually in order to impose threats upon her, because ironically, we all know that if one thing would have changed if Lara Croft was Larry Croft instead, it would be that he wouldn't have been threatened with sexual assault. While everything else could stay the same and the narrative wouldn't feel tangibly different, one of the last threats that would have been written into that moment for Larry Croft would be someone trying to sexually assault him, which makes it abundantly clear for me that it was used in this moment largely for thoughtless, objectifying shock value, because Lara is a woman. In a way, the game seems more interested in exploring and critiquing male-coded traumas, like the violence of warfare. It's a bit of a shame when it has a focus on emotional trauma, but entirely centers that focus on the idea that she has to learn to be okay with brutally killing people. I personally couldn't find anything in the way of Miss Pratchett or Miss O'Connor talking about this to get more clarification on the subject. I'm absolutely not opposed to being wrong about this. All of this is a shame, because I would personally love to see a story with Lara that really emphasizes such thematic readings, without asking me to justify an attempted sexual assault that is forgotten 30 seconds later by the narrative. Just to reiterate and stress it one more time for the people in the back, my problem isn't that Lara was almost sexually assaulted. My problem isn't with Lara at all. My problem is that the writers chose to put her in that situation and then didn't care enough about her to make sure it was meaningful and justified. And while I think a lot of the attempts to express this from games media at the time was kind of messy and not mature enough to express it properly, I still do think the conversation specifically about this scene in this game did a wealth to get us all thinking about how to better write women as protagonists in games in the future. I think we've done a lot to improve since then, though we could do a lot better. Silver lining, I suppose? After finishing Tomb Raider 2013, I realized why I preferred Far Cry 3 so much to this a decade ago. And it was because Far Cry 3 had a world that felt independently hostile. It felt like this world existed and you were an invader. The sharks wanted to eat you, the big cats wanted to eat you, the people wanted to fill you with bullet holes. But you had something they didn't have. Ingenuity. I'm not talking about Jason Brody the character, I'm talking about you as the player. Far Cry 3 gave you options and then said, figure it out. It signposted, but it did so in more limited ways. A wealth of the bases you could take down had very unique gimmicks. Many of the secret caves felt one of a kind. Most of the story missions led you to something that you hadn't really done before. And so much of the time, you had plenty of ways to tackle these problems, even if the game greatly rewarded stealth with much more experience than it did chaos. It's not that Tomb Raider 2013 was more linear and that made it worse or something. It's that it never seems to trust the player to be smart or capable outside of the rare optional tomb. Even without relying on survival vision, which I failed to mention up to this point purely because everything is so heavily signposted that you don't need it, you don't often think in this game. And as such, so much of the design is either very simple or even outright binary. Especially after playing Anniversary and Tomb Raider 1, Tomb Raider 2013 feels really polished and competent, but also so safe and gentle on the player that I still have no interest in really ever replaying it again. My brother loves Rise of the Tomb Raider, and I'm interested in seeing how they followed 2013 up, since Rise is considered a fantastic game by most people I've talked to about it. But 2013 also somehow managed to make me feel less interested in Rise because it was too busy being like nearly every other game from the preceding half-decade. When even one of the central narrative notes this game hits, Lara having to learn to be strong enough to kill humans when necessary, something I was planning to touch on a bit here initially, was already in Tomb Raider Anniversary as it turns out, the game starts to ring a bit hollow. Sure, 2013 tackles that idea far harder, but it's still in Anniversary as a small, pivotal moment. Tomb Raider 2013 is a step up in basically every way in terms of depth and humanity of the storytelling, but for me, that just isn't enough. I mean, heck, I originally wasn't even going to include the stuff about the assault scene in this video. I was thinking about either just keeping it to myself or making a separate editorial video just about that. But I'd taken so few notes about the game by the end that this section would have otherwise been like 8 minutes long and said almost nothing. Contrast that with Anniversary and Tomb Raider 1, where even if those sections end up shorter than this one thanks to the bit about the assault, I couldn't stop pausing every 10 seconds to write more about the things I found compelling or interesting or frustrating. I need to stress that I don't want to suggest this game is bad. Being unoriginal or safe doesn't make something worse, because it could always be someone's first experience with all of the elements that are unoriginal, and that should not be undercut purely because you or I have more lived experience with whatever elements are being discussed. However, that unoriginality can mean that the product or the art ends up fading into the background, and that's largely what Tomb Raider 2013 does for me personally. So then instead of continuing to whine about it, why don't we move on to the next Tomb Raider game I finished, Tomb Raider Anniversary. The easiest place to start talking about Tomb Raider Anniversary is probably with the story. Anniversary is a remake of the original Tomb Raider game rather than a reboot. It aimed to be a modernized interpretation of the first game, including of the story, which is honestly even less notable for me than 2013's was, but that's mostly because there's almost nothing to it, even here. In times well before modern history, there was Atlantis. One of the three beings in charge of it, known as Nadla, was kind of a dick, so her two companions froze her and buried her. At some point, an explosion releases her, and then we cut to modern times where she's in charge of a large corporation that seeks to find the necessary MacGuffins in order to regain her powers and force evolution to an extreme level where everyone turns into, like, Atlantean demons. Lara ends up in the middle of it, collecting pieces of what the game calls a scion, but I'm going to call a scion because that's how I've always heard it pronounced. And when she finally figures out what's going on, she aims to stop Natla from reaching her goals. She succeeds, the end. Unlike Tomb Raider 2013, the story isn't near as big of a part of Anniversary or Tomb Raider 1. Probably less than 20 minutes is devoted to cutscenes in either game, maybe even less than 15 or 10. It is almost entirely set up and justification for your adventuring. And since it's not nearly as big of a part of the game, it matters much less when the story has little that's unique or engaging about it. Anniversary definitely does a good enough job with its narrative, and things feel less scattershot than they do in the original game. However, I don't think the cutscenes are always used in ways that complement the game. Firstly, I'm not a fan of the QuickTime events. The way they're used here is an unnecessary relic of the time, where they're just kind of mindlessly plastered into cutscenes, which then become unskippable because they can be failed. What's more, the way they're presented in the UI, at least on PC, is ugly as heck. Just these generic clip art arrows staring you in the face. I feel similarly about the "this object is interactable" warning indicator when you're actually in standard gameplay. It feels very placeholder. Getting the game to work well enough on PC is really easy. Getting the game to be in a state that I can capture footage of, or you can stream, or where you can use any other applications at the same time, is a nightmare. This game has such a strong window exclusivity state that I couldn't ever access any other part of my PC without closing it. That is, unless I ran the game in a window that was below my screen's resolution, but who wants to play a game with 3/4 of their desktop visible the whole time? There's an easy DLL that you can add to offer controls to improve this, but I couldn't get the control that was supposed to disable the window exclusivity to work. Still, it at least allowed me to make sure OBS was recording properly each time, so that I could make this damned video. Other than that, and a stutter that I suspect was related to it, controller support was fine and I had no real complaints. Graphically, the game looks good for its age, if a little uninspired at times. By that, I mean that while the level design could often make stages feel special aesthetically, a lot of the textures and colors on offer felt just a bit too much like a generic game ruin we've all seen 36 times. Even by this game's release, they undoubtedly looked good, but generic. Sound design is also fine for the time, but special mention has to go to the incredible music. After 2013, I had no clue what to expect with the music, since I felt it wasn't really worth commenting on there. It wasn't bad, but it stood out so little that I remember none of it. But here the music is fantastic. In particular, I adore the main menu theme. It moves me in a way that Oblivion, Morrowind, and early Harry Potter era Jeremy Soule does. It's so phenomenal. As far as I saw, it was made by, excuse my pronunciation, Troels Brun Folman, and it really doesn't disappoint. Animations here feel more deliberately cartoon-like and expressive than 2013, but they're still largely excellent. Voice acting is good. Overall, most of the presentation here works, even if not every aspect of it hits the right notes for me. The worst issue, though, goes back to the cutscenes. Remember a minute ago when I said the cutscenes don't always complement the game well? Part of that comes from how they can sometimes get in the way of the awe of exploring. This is an action-oriented game, so the best way to get your player to feel something you want them to feel is through the gameplay. There are times where Anniversary does what a lot of games back then did, because they were so fervently chasing that cinematic feel. Let me show you a scene from this game, and then the same scene I'd experienced later when I got to the original version in the first game. So I started playing Anniversary back in November. Then things came up, so I stopped playing until January. By the time I got back to it, I'd completely forgotten that it had dinosaurs in that early level. I knew it had dinosaurs, and so I subconsciously knew I'd get to the same point in the original game and find dinosaurs. Hell, I'd even seen the dinosaurs in videos across the decades because Tomb Raider is almost 30 years old at this point. And yet using a fancy cutscene and QuickTime events followed by a gamey and mandatory boss battle where I have to figure out the T-Rex's cute little pattern of foolishness made me effectively forget that it was something I'd see again in the original. Cut to playing that version shortly after finishing Anniversary, and despite more or less knowing it was coming, that version of the reveal was so much more rewarding. No pomp, no circumstance, no QuickTime events, no forced and gimmicky boss battle. Just, oh shit, dinos, alright, I forgot there were dinosaurs in this. Wait, does that mean I have to, oh fuck, what do I do? What do I do? Do I run? It doesn't have a health bar. Can I kill it? Should I hide or shoot it? Or, I'd spent at least an hour with the original game up to that point, and you have to understand, before now, you're exploring a snowy cave entrance, then an underground village that's been abandoned for who knows how long. Along the way, you kill some bats, a fair amount of wolves, and a handful of bears. No people, nothing supernatural, maybe an alligator before then, or some rats, I don't quite remember when they first appear. Then, dinosaurs in this vibrant and lush, but dark and mysterious valley that feels like it's still completely underground, and has been hidden since well before written history. Just like every other enemy, the T-Rex has no health bar. You don't know if you should kill it, can kill it, or if you can outrun it. I tried to kill it at first, got eaten, and so I then decided to find alcoves to hide from it until I could make my way to a broken bridge above where he couldn't reach, and filled him with lead. He has no gimmicks, he isn't stupid, he isn't given any fanfare that isn't completely organic, and the player can tackle the challenge in any number of ways. It's just like, man, there are a few points like this where Anniversary completely dropped the ball, purely because it couldn't stop itself from bringing out the expensive champagne and the Maserati when all anyone wanted was a pizza party and some cheesy indie movies. Maseratis mostly suck anyway. Honestly, the bosses are probably the weakest part of Anniversary in general. I admire their attempts to revamp them so that they feel distinct, like events. The best one is probably the second to last one, which is this crazy demon monster thing high up on a small platform. I also would have liked the two Centaur bros early on, but I thought their shields being bright gold was a bad choice, when I also have to look for the shiny ring on them in order to grapple the shield out of their hands. That one bit of poor conveyance made figuring out that boss really frustrating at first. I think showing the grapple symbol would have trivialized that part of the fight, but it still would have been a better option, I feel, since the real brain teaser there is reflecting their attack that turns you to stone back onto them. Another option would have been finding old documents or something that hinted at the solution earlier on in the level. I thought the final fight with Notla was the weakest though. Too much teleporting around, and it's like the only time in the entire game where suddenly you're expected to wait to do the precision shot thing, because otherwise it won't stagger her. I've heard that this is one of the most consistent failings of Tomb Raider, is that each game has that handful of moments that just have no precedent or proper guidance in the preceding levels, but expect you to just try something completely new and unorthodox for the hell of it. And I feel like this kind of fits that. Speaking of the precision shot mechanic, that's something they did to try and elevate the combat from the original game. Unlike 2013, this game's combat is still primarily about you shooting animals that are looking for a good meal, and also crazy demons near the end. And so if you shoot an enemy enough, Crystal Dynamics wanted you to have a way to sort of call and response with the enemy for a big risk that leads to big rewards. So once you reach a threshold of shots on an enemy, they'll briefly shine and you'll hear a sound cue. Then they'll rush you, and if you time a dodge, it'll enter slow motion and a couple of phantom reticles will come together over the enemy. Time your next shot right, and it doesn't matter how much health the enemy has left, they'll die instantly. Except bosses. While playing through Anniversary, I really liked this mechanic, and overall, I think the combat knows its place in this journey. It's something you'll do on occasion, purely for a pacing break and a bit of danger, but it also completely undermines the secondary weapons you have on offer. A shotgun, two magnums that work like more powerful versions of your basic pistols, and a pair of submachine guns. Outside of one enemy type, or if you just can't be bothered to want to have to think about combat at all, these extra weapons are rendered useless by this precision shot mechanic. After all, if you can fire a handful of shots, dodge using the really broad dodge window, and then shoot once more to end an enemy, why worry about wasting your limited ammo for secondary weapons in case you need it for a boss or something later? Personally, there were other little gripes I had with the combat, but all except one were minor. I didn't love how finicky the target switching could be, and I also really wasn't a fan of the fact that you have to reload your weapons. Yes, even your infinite ammo standard pistols, but you can't manually reload them in any way I found. So you just have to deal with having half a magazine when you start an encounter, and prep for reload time during the middle of a fight, or you just blow the rest of your ammo in that magazine to force Lara to reload. The more annoying problem, though, was the little flying demon bastards that start showing up near the end. They shoot fireballs. These fireballs suck because they can literally cause NES-style knockback for some reason. If you're on a small ledge above lava, get wrecked. If you're facing multiple of them and you get hit by one, hope you don't get stun-locked. They suck, they suck, they suck. I wouldn't mind the combat getting harder, but randomly being blown off my feet and falling straight into instant death isn't hard, it's just cheap. And it's annoying when combat is otherwise not difficult and simply served as a small part of the obstacles you might come across. The final boss also uses these fireballs in a way that just felt obnoxious, to the point where I mostly just resigned myself to tanking them instead of continuing to fail at figuring out how they're supposed to be dodged. Combat here isn't awful, and the flow of achieving precision shots is satisfying in a visceral way, but it's not amazing either, which is why it's good that this game doesn't spend much of its playtime on it and instead wants you to be puzzle platforming. The platforming here is largely wonderful. It's decently varied, it's thoughtful, sometimes it asks you to be on your toes, and other times it asks you to think things through. It can also offer a lot of satisfaction when it comes to exploration. It was absolutely the best part of the game for me, and created an experience that, for someone who never played older Tomb Raider games before now, was immensely satisfying. The puzzles you have to solve, both when platforming and otherwise, are surprisingly varied as well. About the only part of the level design I didn't love, in relation to platforming, was the abundance of loading hallways that also often serve as death traps. Each one that had traps was unique, but it could make levels feel just a bit disjointed, and the hallways themselves blended together regardless. The game is also kinda janky since it seems to be using physics to handle animations, grabs, and most other interactions in the world, at least to some degree. So it's a bit frustrating that Lara will sometimes not properly grab an edge she absolutely should be able to. It's also a bit annoying how often the game expects you to redo climbing segments 2 or 3 times, especially if you're getting artifacts and such, or if she doesn't grab the thing she's supposed to and you fall back to the beginning of a segment. I think the emergency, you grabbed the thing but your grip is about to slip mechanic is nice. It keeps you on your toes, and I'm glad they carried it over to 2013, even though it feels more organic and visceral here, since it will happen if your platforming is sloppy as well, rather than only when you're making particularly perilous jumps. It feels less scripted here. But I think they should have gone just a step further. There are points where maybe you jump just a split second too early and you're gonna miss your ledge or your swinging bar. Lara won't even reach out for them in these cases, meaning she frustratingly just falls to whatever's below. I think this emergency grab could have served as a tiny buffer for these situations. It could extend her reach when making small spacing mistakes just a bit, but would still punish you with a fall if you miss the emergency grab button. There are also times where part of the ledge you're on will crumble and fall. Fine in theory, but for me it always felt a bit cheap since you can't jump sideways on these, so they're always about noticing and avoiding them, which is fine, or scurrying across them and jumping up to a ledge just above before the collapse happens. They're timed in really finicky, hard to read ways, so it feels cheap when you time your inputs to jump off a split second too early, and Lara just decides not to even attempt to jump up up to the safe ledge to grab it. It's worth noting that I played with the manual grab option enabled, by the way, so I had to hold the button to enable grabbing, otherwise Lara would just ignore grabbable surfaces and fall. That means with automatic grabs enabled instead, it's possible the game may behave more or less favorably, but I suspect it won't change since it's not like you have to time your grabs with the manual grab option. Instead, it's more like you are either in grab mode because you're holding the button, where Lara will attempt to grab as soon as she can reach something grabbable, or you're not holding the grab button and therefore not in grab mode, and she won't ever attempt to grab anything. As such, I suspect automatic grabs just kind of put Lara into a constant state of grab mode and wouldn't fix any of these issues. Another quick thing worth noting before we start wrapping up Anniversary is that there's an extra stage separated from the main game, Lara's house, Croft Manor. Since it's underneath New Game in the main menu, I assumed it was something you were meant to do after the game or in bits and pieces during it, but apparently it's a training level. Still, it's a fun piece of design that feels non-linear, while also gently guiding you and having low stakes. It's like Tomb Raider Anniversary Zen mode, and honestly, it makes me kind of want a Tomb Raider Metroidvania set in a big castle and the surrounding areas or something. When it comes down to it, part of me feels that this game is way too jank for its own good, and for that reason, about 2/3 through, I was getting antsy to finish it and move on. But if that jank wasn't there, I would probably like this game so much that I'd be bursting with praise. I prefer the less puzzle dungeon-oriented exploration and platforming challenges to the stuff that's more like a platforming take on a Zelda temple, and most of the raw exploration-focused platforming was earlier on, but damn, it was still so clever in its platforming design in general. So despite the jank, I enjoyed this so much more than 2013 that it's astonishing. 2013 is much more polished. I would argue it's a better built game, and Anniversary is simple both in ways that help it and hurt it. The story is simpler than even Tony Hawk's Underground, which I explicitly commented on the narrative simplicity of in a recent review of it, though cutscene direction here is stronger than that game as well, which helps. I like the isolated feeling that Anniversary offers though, which was intentional according to a special thanks you can access in the rewards section. Most of your time is spent in level, doing the things the game does best. Despite my problems with it, I liked the simplicity of the combat and the lack of humans I needed to gun down. While I can see it may be feeling tired by 2007, in 2024, this game's design is refreshing. If I had the time, I'd go through the commentary, since I'm interested in more of the thought processes while making the game. Alas, my problems aren't with most of the design choices, just certain aspects of the execution. By the time I was finished with Anniversary, I was incredibly curious as to how all of this stacked up to the original version though, so let's move on to that one next. Tomb Raider 1 was a game I was initially worried about playing through. I'd been told it was long. Very long. Obviously, I knew it was very PS1 in terms of its design. I knew it used tank controls, and I'd messed around for 10 minutes with emulation here or there a few times over the decades, so I knew it was precise and really required setting up your jumps. It was slow, and I was a bit terrified of working my way through 15 hours of it or whatever, only being halfway through and being so frustrated that I was desperate to give up. But at the same time, especially after playing Anniversary, I was incredibly curious about what it was like. I'm used to games this old. I'm used to tank controls. I grew up with that shit. So I decided just to go for it. And I'm extremely glad I did. I don't know whether I like Tomb Raider 1 or Tomb Raider Anniversary more. The original wears its clunk on its sleeves, where Anniversary feels much smoother and more comfortable to play foundationally. But once you get used to the original game's jank, that's it. It works as intended, whereas Anniversary sometimes just decides to give you the middle finger, causing unexpected frustrating failures that really don't feel like they're your fault. Initially, I was going to try and only use the save crystals. In Anniversary, you are given checkpoints every few minutes, so even the worst failures rarely set you back very far. But the console versions of the original, of which I'm playing the PS1 version here as natively as possible through an emulator, presumably couldn't really do checkpoints, secondary autosaves, or quick saves. So instead, it has save points scattered throughout the levels, and these save points are single use. Once you've saved there, it's gone. So you might go 10, 20, 30 minutes between saves if you manage them poorly, or don't find one nearby. And when one botched jump or a poorly managed combat encounter can destroy you, that sounds like a nightmare. Still, I figured it would be worth at least trying to play this game the way millions would have had to back on the PS1. I gave up on that and started using save states around the T-Rex fight, because otherwise that would have caused me to pull my hair out. I like that the fight is optional, organic, and can even be cheesed, but head-on fighting it when you don't know these games well can be a mess of instant kills, being rubbed to death, or pushed up against walls and stun-locked. I think using save states is okay, because Core Design also made the PC version that came out the same day as the PS1 version, a few weeks after the Saturn version, and it offered manual quick saves that you can make anywhere. I feel like that means they would have done that on other platforms too, were it feasible. Ultimately, it came down to enjoyment. I could have forced myself to only use the crystals, but that would have pushed me to either use a guide for everything and enjoy the core exploration a lot less, or I probably would have ended up hating the experience. Thanks to Stella at TombRaiders.net for the wonderful guides that did help whenever I was stuck, by the way. It's a killer website that was incredibly useful at the most frustrating junctures. After a certain level of punishment, though, there was little value in me playing through it the exact way I would have had to in 1996 on PS1, especially because I never would have had the patience to beat it that way back then either. I think the game plays better with save states, at least for a first playthrough, and I think it's justified because the PC version that released alongside it had that feature. Not that I have to justify that choice to anyone, but I feel like transparency about what decisions I made with the save system and why I made them is worth having. After all, it makes a huge difference in how the game feels to play. One thing that caught me off guard was how the spirit of the original often shined through in Anniversary. Again, the Lost Valley is a good early example. You make your way around a lake and a waterfall, as well as a cave system, to find yourself in this big, hidden valley. You then meet the T-Rex near a temple, and then you make your way back up the level to progress. You have the Colosseum, and the level in the tower where you go to the room with the hammer and electricity, or the room with the falling swords, the Four Bridges level, the cistern, climbing up the side of the underground pyramid near the end. I wasn't sure how many of these ideas were Anniversary taking liberties and reimagining things, and I'm really glad that a lot of it was also in the original. Anniversary focuses a lot more on complex puzzles, whereas this original version relies heavily on how dangerous a single jump can be, and how methodical you need to be to survive, and I can appreciate that. The controls will initially feel clunky and really complicated, but then you recognize how much is missing if you've already played Anniversary. Sure, Tomb Raider 1 really wants you to take single jumps seriously. You have to walk carefully up to ledges for tighter jumps, or space yourself properly for run-ups that lead to longer jumps. To get the right jumps, you have to press buttons in the correct order with the correct timing. You on rare occasion even have to time your grab right, or Lara will stop reaching before you arrive at the platform you're jumping to. But you're also missing backwards jumps off walls. You have ledge shimmies but not horizontal or vertical ledge-to-ledge jumps. You have no grapple hook, so no pulling things down while running or swinging. No crouch walk or even a crouch at all. No balancing on narrow points. You push and pull blocks in both games, but in Tomb Raider 1 you can only move them one block-sized spot at a time because it's on a grid. And you can only move them in the cardinal directions. It's also missing missing the emergency grab when your grip slips, and probably a lot of other smaller things I'm not thinking about. The game doesn't even have optional relics or artifacts to find. This all obviously necessitates simpler level design, and therefore puzzle design is also simpler and focuses more on seeing things you can jump to or interact with from the right vantage points. But that also means that despite the complexity of readying yourself for and making a single jump, there is a significantly smaller pool of options you need to memorize and master, balancing things back out. As such, the clunk here isn't near as bad as you'd expect. They knew their limitations well and built around them, and I think it helped going from Tomb Raider 2013 to Anniversary to here. Getting more and more clunky was almost like going from an easy mode with all of the assists on to a harder mode and then an even harder mode where eventually all the assists are disabled and you're in complete control. As I played the previous games, I grew warning-like expectations for what difficulties I might face in this earliest, most rudimentary game, by playing what was supposed to be its modernized incarnations first. I'm not sure I would have had near as much patience for Tomb Raider 1 in its original form otherwise, but realizing its relative simplicity, while also recognizing what was indeed brought forward, helped a lot. That being said, not all of the clunk is something that feels understandable. In particular, the game's combat is clunky in a way that feels old and frustrating at times. There isn't much to it beyond trying to keep the enemy in sight, keeping your guns trained on them, and jumping out of the way of their attacks. Easier said than done given the controls, but I don't think it was devoid of thought. As an easy example, the camera zooms out to see more of what's around you with your weapons drawn, which is something that feels at least 5 years more modern than you'd expect from an early PS1 title. Still, I was never quite sure what the combat wanted from me because the game never tutorialized it, until I eventually realized, I guess, that it didn't want anything more from me than to flail around like I was already doing. Fighting in tight corridors can be an awful experience though. Especially when there are a lot of enemies, it's not uncommon for stuff like this to happen, which feels hilariously unfair. In a similar vein, I dislike how the character Pierre sometimes shows up 50 million times a level just to eat your health in the second set of levels. It's not a bad idea, but he's never engaging to stand there and shoot at, because his weapons, like yours, are hit scan, and his AI is too basic. And thankfully, the simplicity of the combat does push things in the game's favor compared to Anniversary in a few ways. The centaur enemies that were bosses in Anniversary are just optional enemies here, and they don't have any complex mechanical demands, so there's no confusion about ripping their shields away. The flying enemies near the end are far less cheap and annoying, as is the final boss. Secondary weapons were more useful here too, but it was mostly because Lara was so effective in combat in Anniversary, and I didn't need anything else as a crutch most of the time. Here, Lara is pretty bad at combat either way, so more firepower can at times be very effective. Honestly, aside from the combat, the thing that made me use save states most frequently was how labyrinthine some levels were. Similar to Anniversary, but worse because of the chunky, simple graphics, it can be easy at times to lose your sense of place when parts of levels overlap, and that in turn can make it easy to unknowingly take the wrong drop off a ledge, only to find that returned you to the start of an area 10 minutes and 3 platforming gauntlets ago. At that point, you kinda want to stop fucking around and spam save states to ensure you're not fiddling with minor jumps as you make your way back. This type of thing, along with the slower gameplay in general, is a large part of what contributes to the length of this game. I do like how much more non-linear and organic the levels here feel, but it can also contribute to them taking far too long. This game is not only longer because the general pace of gameplay actions is slower and more methodical, but also because it's so easy to spend time exploring areas you don't need to yet, only to have to come back later. Where a stage at its longest in Anniversary might take 35 minutes of real time, 45 including mistakes and restarts, a level here might take 45 minutes excluding mistakes and restarts, and up to an hour and a half including them. And this game has one more stage than Anniversary too, 5 if you include the 4 extra PC levels called Unfinished Business. I tried to use Tomb Raider Gold to play the extra levels on the PS1 emulator, since I don't have the PC version of Tomb Raider 1, but I couldn't get it to work sadly, so maybe one day I'll give them a look if I revisit the game for the new collection. Anyway, if you only relied on the save crystals, I can imagine the levels taking whole days of chipping away and perfecting them. You might only have 3 to 5 saves per level, which amounts to 3 to 5 checkpoints for a 45-minute gauntlet. The amount of time you'd lose with every risky mistake would be enormous. I made enough of those each level to probably require 5 hours of time to complete each harder level if I was just using save crystals. It's even more brutal than something like Dark Souls bonfires, because if you use a save crystal at a bad time, it's just gone forever. Given your limited healing, you could potentially even softlock yourself, requiring a complete level restart. Personally, I feel like the game was too long. I could have seen it cut by a third or even half, and still gotten all the enjoyment out of it that I did. I felt similarly with Anniversary, but the fatigue there was primarily from the inconsistency of some mechanics, and the fact that I wasn't always into the puzzles. In the original, it's a combination of how slow it was, with how little progress it sometimes feels like you make when you keep running into another block puzzle, or another series of jumps like 10 others you've done, or another boulder to dodge. Tomb Raider 1 took me 16.5 hours, Anniversary was 15.5, and 2013 was 10.5. And honestly, while 2013 felt longer, I kind of would have preferred if every game I played was about that length. Granted, 2013 had a lot of side content I had little interest in exploring, but I don't think either Anniversary or the original needed to be this long. They could have still been satisfying if shorter, and then simply had challenge maps made out of the other portions cut out of the main game, or something similar that could give a quick burst of Tomb Raider goodness. While traps can be a bit overused at times and are also kind of clunky, I like that they're organic. This way of doing it for me is much preferred to QuickTime events, even though I am not inherently against QuickTime events. Whether it's the boulders, the T-Rex, or whatever else, it's just nice to be playing and have something interesting or unique happen that you then have to respond to with the game knowledge you have. That can be far more immersive than something more bombastic and scripted at times. I don't want it to sound like I'm sour on Anniversary after playing the first game. Both are creative, fun games with their own highs and lows, and when both games falter, boy, they can suck the joy out really swiftly. I also don't hate 2013 or think it's bad at all, even if I don't enjoy it much. I guess it's just so impressive how well the original game holds up if you're okay with the jank. You'd expect that from a game like Anniversary or 2013, but not a PS1 era precision puzzle platformer with tank controls. And that mostly extends to the presentation as well. The music is just as great here as it was in Anniversary. The sound design is less amazing, but still good. My main complaint is that I wish the silence was broken up with the noises of birds, bugs, plants, rustling, etc. This type of thing is rare, and the only examples of ambient noise I can think of are water and an ambient noise musical track that's clearly instruments and not environmental noises. Despite complaining that Anniversary looked kinda generic, I like the visual design of both this and Anniversary for different reasons, but I personally gravitate a bit toward the dark, cramped, almost foreboding aesthetic the original gives off. I personally love the first area's aesthetic the most, especially in this original incarnation. Something about a well-lit, lush, underground cave city has always been one of my favorite level types in games. Lara's animations are incredibly weighty and fluid for the time as well, which I feel is super important to making this platforming work as confidently as it does. The second to last boss is insanely disturbing looking in this one though, compared to Anniversary. While Tomb Raider 1 is a very rewarding game, it's also a highly demanding and punishing one, even by PS1 era standards, and it makes me incredibly interested in how these new remasters are going to handle that. Are they going to be okay with releasing games with this level of clunk and mechanical grit? And how do you remove a lot of it without creating a cascade of changes that demand other changes, that demand still other changes, that demand still other changes, until you no longer have remasters as much as you have more of an Anniversary style remake or reimagining? Will you be able to quick save? Will save crystals be reusable? Will the tank controls be changed? Will grabbing be more forgiving? If you've played it, let me know in the comments, because I didn't see any media on it beyond that initial trailer. That's where I was going to end this section and wrap up the video, but then I got access to one more extra little goodie, and it inspired me to add more than just a couple extra sentences acknowledging it. Despite not being able to try the unfinished business levels in Gold Edition, I was able to give the cancelled 10th Anniversary Edition for PSP a try. This was an earlier attempt at a Tomb Raider Anniversary remake by Core Design, which was then cancelled, and we later got Crystal Dynamics' Tomb Raider Anniversary instead, once Tomb Raider Legends put some distance between the series and the monumental failures of Angel of Darkness. Obviously, keep in mind that 10th Anniversary is unfinished. Most levels I tried failed to load. Visually, there are a lot of bugs. Lara is invincible, and so are the millions of wolves. At one point I got pushed out of bounds, which put me back at the start of the first level, after some rocks had blocked my return earlier, meaning I had to restart. But at the same time, it was a fantastic glimpse at what could have been. And maybe what could be with this new collection. As my original ending for this video suggested, in between finishing Tomb Raider 1 and playing 10th Anniversary, I was honestly kind of at a loss for how they could make a remaster of the first game that wasn't a remake, but that still felt less clunky and cumbersome than the original PS1 version. I'm honestly curious, but also worried about this collection now, because they clearly stuck to the grid system. It looks like they stuck to the tank controls. They seem to have stuck to the original level geometry as well, meaning some of the texture work really doesn't fit how blocky everything is. Even the animations look the same as the original, and I'm just not sure if many new or younger players could put up with how methodical and tough this game is, considering how long it is. But this demo of sorts opened my eyes either to what I'm just not seeing in this remastered trilogy trailer, or what they failed to accomplish with it, that Core Design was doing like 20 years ago now. Lara's animations feel the same in this, but they look even better. Her initial stride that gets her up to speed is great. You still have a vaguely tank control-like feel, but she will also rotate with a stick like a more modern game from a standstill. And if you want completely old-school tank controls, you hold the walk button. You still don't walk off ledges while holding the walk button, but if a fall would have caused fall damage in the final version of the game, Lara will turn and grab the ledge last minute, saving you from accidents. Lara gets up to speed almost immediately, meaning you no longer have to walk back a full grid square to make long jumps. Her grab seems to stay held if the button stays held, instead of having to delay it for certain, very specifically janky jumps. She'll auto-mantle short blocks if you hold the jump or action button down. If she'd normally bonk the wall during a jump because you were just a hair too close to grab it right, she'll enter a much nicer looking bonk animation, but it's one that still grabs the ledge. More of a warning than a punishment. She also has a different animation for perilous grabs that's similar to her emergency grab quicktime event from Tomb Raider Anniversary, but there's no emergency grab mechanic, so it's just a nice aesthetic. You can also now shimmy around corners. You can shoot bats off of the ceiling now, which it was kind of silly that you couldn't do in the original because it's like, Lara would know these bats are gonna try to eat her face, so why wouldn't she shoot them before they have the chance? There are ladders to climb so that they could streamline some level design that was otherwise needlessly long-winded. Saving is still done with blue crystals, but interestingly, you also carry green crystals with you, and could presumably find more, which effectively allows you to carry a limited amount of quick saves around with you. That's a fantastic compromise between the deliberacy of the console versions of the original game and the PC version's easy-to-abuse quick saves. And it gives the player one more interesting thing to think about. I could go on and on with the tweaks. All of this stuff does make the game easier. Sure, I was invincible, but this version is smooth enough that I still would have been able to breeze through the gear collection section of the Lost Valley level in just 10 minutes even without the invincibility. Whereas in the original, despite knowing where to go now, I'd bet it would still take me at least twice as long just because of how slow and demandingly precise the platforming has to be. And not everything was perfect. The Lost Valley level also still had a cutscene reveal for the T-Rex, though at least there were no quicktime events, he still had no health bar, he didn't have any boss gimmicks, and you could choose to handle him in any way you wished, including skipping him. But still, man, I want that version of Tomb Raider now. Again, I'm not sure how the remaster collection will handle everything, since I haven't looked at anything beyond that initial trailer as of writing this, and hell, I don't even know how many of those 10th anniversary ideas came from later PS1 era Tomb Raider titles. But despite being a completely unfinished, messy tech demo of sorts that was basically put together into some sort of vaguely working order by loving fans, this showed me exactly what type of compromises could be made for a proper remaster of the first game. One that doesn't painfully obviously look like it's on a grid, one that feels like it has strong art design, one that feels smoother to play, but importantly for me, still feels like it knows what was important about the original Tomb Raider, what made it Tomb Raider. And fuck, I really appreciate that, and I had a lot of fun poking around in it, because the original Tomb Raider is awesome. I equally had similar amounts of fun making this video, most of the time. Despite finding it boring, it was nice to finally finish Tomb Raider 2013, and I've found new games to return to and other games to be excited to try one day thanks to Anniversary and the original Tomb Raider. They each have problems, but there's only one game here that I'm not fond enough of to return to, and I think that's a pretty good outcome.